Last week, we read John's account of Jesus appearing to Mary, and later the disciples and to Thomas in a secret locked room. Do you all remember that? Because the disciples were afraid of remember who? Rhymes with ooze. Of the Jews, yes. There you go. That particular passage from last week, afraid of what the Jews might do to them, has been one of the passages used from the New Testament throughout these last 2,000 years to persecute and kill our Jewish sisters and brothers. I'm sure many of whom were with you, Sylvia, on that cruise. This week, in fact, Sylvia Nielsen-Ioka, who has led us so beautifully in our lay reading this morning, will be going to First Presbyterian Church at Burbank, I believe, and you will be participating in the Days of Remembrance. And what they lift up is not just the history of the Holocaust, but they lift up how our combined history is evolved in that story. In today's passage, the passage that Sylvia read to us so beautifully, we have the evangelist Luke speaking, and he himself was an outsider, a Greek. And his account of the Jesus appearance after the resurrection could not have been more different. In last week's account, as I said, John had Jesus appearing in secret to the disciples. In this week's account, Jesus appears to two people so unimportant that only one of them is named, huddled not in secret, but walking along an open road for all the world to see. They were journeying toward a little city called what? Emmaus. Now, Emmaus means, in either Aramaic or Greek, it means warm spring. So maybe Cleophas and his unnamed friend, unlike the frightened disciples that we heard about in John, were returning to their home in Warm Springs, a little suburb of Jerusalem, or maybe they just wanted to get away from all of the sadness in Jerusalem and go to the guy spot up at Warm Springs, just north of Jerusalem, to relax. The crucifixion of all of their hopes and dreams had been too much. Maybe they just wanted to get away. But like the disciples locked in that little room in Jerusalem, they were so overcome with their sorrow and their disillusionment, their own sorrow and their own disillusionment, that they didn't realize that the fulfillment of all of their hopes and dreams was walking right there along with them. As Annette and Judy sang, they were not walking alone. Biblical truth is like that. The circumstances, locked room, open road, are often unimportant. What is germane to the story is the disposition of the biblical characters and the disposition of us, the overhearers. Here is the truth of both of these after the resurrection accounts. To the extent that you insist on huddling or journeying, looking back, consumed with regret, success has a hard time making its presence felt, heard, and seen, even if it is Christ Jesus himself. If you and TAC had been engaged in a discussion about whether we turned off the air conditioning or didn't turn on the alarm system or something, you might have missed the reunion with your friend in the elevator. If we are not open to what is coming toward us, we miss our blessing. I was just a teenager when JFK was assassinated, and still a very young man when 5 years later, on my sister's birthday, April 4th, the same day that we were to bury my father, that Martin Luther King was assassinated. It seemed to me that the civil rights era, as I knew it, was over. The civil rights era, as I wanted it to be, just that, civil, gentle, urbane, protests at the Washington Monument, Mahalia Jackson singing, as all of us who lived through it would like to remember it, was over. Riots now broke out in the streets almost every day. Angry, hateful, racist words were being screamed at each other all the time. The dreams of so many people who wanted the world to be a more loving and more tolerant place seemed to be strung up, hung up, crucified, and killed, dead. Never mind that all over the world, schools, camps, colleges, and even churches have been integrated. As I walked along the road, surveying the landscape, it seemed to me that God's dream for the blessed community seemed doomed as never before. As I journeyed, like Cleophas and his friend, my eyes and perhaps my very heart were so hardened that I couldn't see. I couldn't see that compassionate, loving citizens of the world of all ages and all races were forever transformed by the events that had happened around them, by events that had happened to them, and were determined not to let the vision of these great dreamers die with their bodies. Thanks to people more courageous than the younger me, hope for a brighter tomorrow walked in the seemingly overwhelming presence of defeat and disappointment. I could not have dreamed that America and the world, still not whole, but at least openly aware that it was not whole, would, in its brokenness, become bolder, moving in a direction away from altars where only the most holy dare to come, to open tables where everybody is welcome, having the hard conversations that it continues to have today. But if you lowly listen, life has a way of teaching you, doesn't it? That in the worst pain, if you look for it, the seeds of hope are immediately planted and begin to grow. Journalist Terry Anderson had worldwide diplomatic immunity, so he thought. He was a member of the International Press Corps and reporting on the Lebanese Civil War. One day after a tennis game playing with other privileged Western players, he was taken prisoner walking down the open streets of Beirut. Perhaps like Cleophas and his unnamed friends, he was on his way to a getaway spot like Warm Springs, like Emmaus. For the next 6 years, while the rest of the world read about him and was frightened for what was happening to him, he was moved around chiefly in the trunks of cars to undisclosed locations. He was no longer a privileged Westerner. He was a prisoner of war. Anderson later wrote that he lost all hope of ever being free again. He lost the ability to pray. His heart was hardened. Why were the hopes taken away from him? He couldn't reach his government, let alone find his God in his captivity. He didn't realize that he was on the news every day and night in America and all over the world. Children studied him in classrooms. He, on the other hand, locked in car trunks, considered himself already dead. 6 years later, when he was released and he saw how the world rejoiced at his freedom, he said it came to him that though he had lost his ability to pray, he saw now in hindsight that in the prayers of the entire rest of the world, God's Spirit had walked with him. Even when his eyes were hardened, as he looked at his captors, he had never walked alone. A minister friend of mine called me complaining because she had worked so hard on her worship service. And she had every prayer and every song just where she wanted it. And she knew when it was going to crest and when the people were going to say amen. She'd even written it in for the worship leader. But what upset her so badly was that a senior member of her congregation, a man who came to church every Sunday, was diagnosed with an inoperable disease. And everybody who got up that morning didn't follow the script. They were all in tears, crying for this man who was about to lose his life. And what the people testified was, he was the one who had welcomed them in the church, whether they were old, young, married, single, straight or gay. He took them to lunch. He took them to dinner. He knew their names. He always made a place for them. He was the one who created the reunion, to use your word, around this table. And when they found that he was about to make his transition, they were so overcome that it spilled out into the worship service. And my minister friend was just so upset. She could not see that the presence of God had entered into this place as people shared about this love that would not die. I know that each one of you this week has heard enough about the Clippers. You know who Donald Sterling is. You probably can almost recite that conversation he had on tape verbatim if you had to. You know all there is to know about it. But there are other conversations that have been going on also. Yesterday at the Metropolitan Opera, there was an opera that was sung called I Puritani, the Puritans. And it was a glorious performance. The soprano was a Russian lady by the name of Olga. I will not venture to pronounce her last name. And the tenor was an American, an African American, whose last name is Brownlee, I believe. And what happened at the Metropolitan Opera yesterday was something that had not happened in over half a century. The male in a couple of star-crossed lovers was of a different race. And for those of you who don't listen to opera, you go, well, isn't the music the thing? Not for opera lovers. It's okay if the character actors are different races. But when it comes to those lead players, racism, just like it existed in the story about the Clippers, had to be broken down also. And so yesterday, the opera house burst, not just because their singing was glorious, but burst because conversations had erupted in such a way that another barrier was broken down. You and I have the opportunity, as we listen to silly conversations about race and orientation and age entitlement and who deserves health insurance and who doesn't deserve health insurance. You know, we live in a country now where we no longer have the best health insurance coverage in the world because other countries are moving to make sure that all of their people are covered, while the people that we vote for are trying to win elections on the back of who pays for this insurance or who doesn't pay for this insurance. You and I have the opportunity at this time in our lives to look at conversations about bigotry and say our eyes are opened as we walk the Emmaus Road. We see Jesus in everyone. We see Jesus in the breaking of the bread for everyone. And the NBA, when we hear the story about it, can stand for more than just the National Basketball Association. Or it can stand for more in our own church than just the National Benevolent Association. In our conversation, as we break down the walls of bigotry everywhere we go, because our eyes are open and we know that we never walk alone. The NBA can come to stand for no bigotry anymore. Let's pray. God, we are a small congregation, it seems. And when we concern ourselves about our size, we often miss the fact that that gentle spirit brushing past our ear, that lizard on the porch when we leave the church, that hummingbird that hovers in the garden around the roses, is your presence passing by us. Help us, regardless of our size, never to be afraid to welcome the stranger into our presence. Help us to understand that in doing so, we continue to entertain angels unaware. Even it is in your Son's name